But his argument is that the city of man has the seeds of his own destruction within it. The passions, that lead to destruction, eventually have the seeds of his own destruction. So it was not the Christian value of love thy neighbor that has caused Rome's destruction. It was his own values of this assertion of will. Eventually you assert, and someone else is going to assert. And you don't have, you can come up and be strong for a season, but those values have the seeds of their own destruction. So eventually you have corruption, and you have the lack of self-control and the self-discipline, and it breaks down. So that was his argument, because he was arguing against the notion that the Christian mentality was responsible for the fall of Rome. Actually, Nietzsche argued something similar during the latter half of the 19th century, when he contrasted Christian slave morality, which is what he called it, with the old pagan master morality. And basically, the more natural way for humans to react is this assertion of will, the will to power. And he talked about in European culture, he talked about what he referred to as the death of God, the death in the belief of God. And that this phenomena of the rejection of the Christian value system was going to lead to the Superman, the person who was going to assert their will and take over, and then they're going to have wars and all this conflict. But out of all these wars and conflict, there emerges a Superman, and he's going to assert his will, and you're going to have a return of the master morality. And this is exactly what Hitler saw himself as he's going to put into place. Nietzsche didn't believe in an absolute set of morality, so might makes right. The assertion of will is the only thing that counts. This love thy neighbor is a slave morality, according to Nietzsche. And sure, when you come from a slave background, you're going to want to promote values where you are at the top of the moral order. Love thy neighbor. Well, that's easy for a slave to say, because they haven't got the power or the courage to assert their will over someone and dominate them. And so that's his argument. That's why he calls it slave morality. So in a nutshell, the idea that the value system from the pagan world to today was turned on its head by Christian moral worldview, the Judeo-Christian moral worldview, was understood even by Christianity's critics. And so, again, what the Quakers failed to take into consideration is it might be a little bit harder to sow the seeds of the word of peace in the cultures that had very strong adherence to the martial virtues and had not had a strong foundation in the Christian worldview. Not impossible, but a little bit harder. So I think, personally, I don't think they took that into consideration. And as time went on, the American settlers started to realize this, and I talked about earlier these captivity narratives where you had women taken into captive by hostile Indian tribes, and that their families were destroyed and everything like that, and they persevered through it, and they wrote these narratives, and it was so common that they had this literary genre called captivity narratives, and where they talked about their ordeal as a test of their faith, and they actually were grateful for this opportunity, to test their faith, because they had read about the early time the Christianity had the martyrdom and all this stuff like that. So you had these people who were tested greatly in their faith, and they were able to achieve supernatural things because they remained victorious. So they saw this as these ordeals as an opportunity. But it also, if you read these pieces, what they're suffering is pretty atrocious. And this way of thinking, way of doing things was touched upon in the Declaration of Independence when these lists of grievances against the king, when Jefferson wrote these lists of grievances against the king. I'm going to cut halfway through, because this is to the part where it's dealing with the use of the Indians. And has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of the frontier of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Known rule of warfare. So this is not a question of a few individuals straying from a value system that otherwise would have taught them not to do this. This is their known rule of warfare. Now, rule of warfare, what are they talking about? Well, as inheritors of the Judeo-Christian tradition, they were heirs of the just war theory that the Catholic Church had developed from the time of Augustine up through the Middle Ages. And if you have to engage in warfare, it has, it's got to be done for the right reasons, and you have to limit the damage to combatants. Non-combatants are off limits, and these are the rules of warfare according to the just war theory, developed by Christian thinkers throughout the Middle Ages, starting with Augustine, going all the way back to St. Paul. The state has the right to wield the sword as a terror against the evildoer and a protector of the innocent. So there are conditions in which it is just to go to war for the defense of the innocent, and there's a whole set of theory as to how war should be conducted in order for it to be considered, to remain to be considered just. And so this is the standard when they're talking about rule of warfare, whose known rule of warfare. So again, they're not just deviating from an agreed upon code of conduct in regarding war. They have a different code of conduct, conflicting codes of conduct. And so it's difficult, a little bit more difficult to appeal to the conscience when that conscience is clear because they think what they're doing is right. Because, war is the assertion of will, and the martial virtues are something noble, and to be ascribed, is something that you should have aspirations for. And so in the mind of the warrior, what they're doing is not wrong or against their values. It is in line with their value system. Now, I want to quickly go into something else that I think Dr. Kagan overlooks when he's talking about the rise of the idea of peace. And I think it's related. We talked earlier about the Judeo-Christian notion of justice and the notion of economics, and how you can't separate the economic realm from the moral realm, and that they're intertwined. And I want to distinguish, these are economic terms, but at that time, the economy or economics is part of a human activity. And so they didn't separate it into separate disciplines like we do today. Human activity is human activity. Economics, psychology, sociology, theology, philosophy, these things were not separate disciplines. Like today they're all separated, and you have someone who knows about economics, someone knows about theology, but they're not an integrated worldview of understanding of human behavior. And back then they were. In economics, you use the term zero-sum versus win-win. A zero-sum mentality means that the resources are limited. So therefore, if someone gains, someone else loses. Someone's gain is someone else loses. And so if you want to get ahead, you got to be the one that gains. So you don't want to be the one that loses. So this leads to a potential for tension. And nations go to war over resources because they have this zero-sum mentality that resources are finite and there's only so much to go around, and I better get mine before he gets his, because if he gets his, I'm going to lose out. So you had, and we talked about this earlier, this idea of resources are finite, yes, but human creativity is not. So human creativity can use resources, the finite resources, in different ways so that the wealth created is not so finite and the pie expands. And so if you're thinking in terms of creating more wealth because of human creativity, the human factor, the creative human factor, the entrepreneurial factor, then you don't have a zero-sum game. You have a win-win situation. And now, even yes, the Judeo-Christian worldview, philosophical, moral worldview, undermined the martial virtues.